Hello and welcome to the Wire Talks. I'm Sidharth Bhatia. They lasted for less than a decade as a group. All their well known songs were recorded in the 60s. They broke up 55 years ago. So many more music genres and popular artists have emerged since then. So, why are they still big? Why do their songs still get downloaded in humongous numbers from Spotify and other places? And most of all, how come they won a Grammy just this year? The Beatles continue to be popular with generation after generation. Their albums sell big, and the two individual performers who are still alive draw crowds even though now they are in their 80s. Ringo Starr just had a number one album, and Paul McCartney continues touring all around the world. Films continue to be made and books on them published regularly. My guest today, Oliver Craske, is somebody who knows quite a lot about this. Craske, who's an author and book editor, wrote An Indian Son, The Life and Music of Ravi Shankar, a well-received biography of Ravi Shankar, and worked on many books about the Beatles. The Beatles Anthology, The Beatles Get Back, which accompanied the Peter Jackson film, and George Harrison, Living in a Material World. He's going to tell us why the Beatles still endure after so many years. Oliver Craske, welcome to the Wire Talks.
Thank you, Siddharth. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Oliver, tell us succinctly in a few short words, what is the secret of this enduring popularity of the Beatles?
Gosh, that's a big question. I don't think there's just
few short words.
I don't think there's just one reason, but fantastic music is the baseline of everything, which somehow still endures and appeals to new generations. And lots of other factors as well. I mean, maybe we can go into lots of things, including the kind of personalities that they were, and the innovation that they represented in their time, and which I think is still carrying through amazingly even today. And I'd say also what they kind of represent to new generations. This, maybe there's a bit of nostalgia for the 1960s and the kind of that era of real positivity and so on. And maybe in today's times, we still need lots of that, a dose of that.
Yeah, so we'll go by one with all those points and a few more that will come up, I hope. But I want to pick up on the fact that fantastic music. Now, if I were to play devil's advocate, fantastic music has come from so many bands since, so many artists since, even their contemporaries. You may argue, even though some people don't like them, the Stones, Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, fantastic music of that generation, and then you jump generations and there's fantastic music right up to today. And yet the Beatles still get downloaded the most. While I was researching, I was quite surprised to know that they still get downloaded the most on Spotify compared to the others. Now, we are not talking Taylor Swift, of course, but still. So there must be something special. Now, let's take fantastic music. Would you say that it's also because they were the first? They were innovators with every album they produced. They were innovators technologically, as well as in terms of the songwriting. And there's something about those songs that carries through these generations. I mean, if you take even a simple song like I saw her standing there, or she was just 17, or whatever, or P.S. I love you, simple songs, simple words, or you jump a few albums and you come to Tomorrow Never Knows, and you jump a few more albums. So would you say it was the constant innovation that is contemporary even today?
I think that's a big part of it. I mean, obviously they became these massive global stars early on. By 1964, they were really global stars. So we're talking only about less than 18 months after their first recording with George Martin. And to our ears, maybe that music does sound pretty simple. I think that's true, but I think at the time it sounded entirely fresh and new, and so they were doing something very new and setting the bar higher than anyone else had done. And then, as you say, they continue to evolve in that short decade, less than a decade that they were around. There's this incredible musical transformation, which mirrored also how they looked, their sort of visual looks, how fast that evolved, and how the world was changing so quickly in that period. So I think that sense of constant innovation, constantly moving on. Every album is something new again, and there's a change in the sound. It's just phenomenal to, I think, even now, just to listen to that development. And there were other fantastic bands. I mean, it was a real golden age for pop music at the time. There were lots of others around, but somehow they were always on the cutting edge of everything, and they were listening to everyone else around them, so they were absorbing all those influences. So they were listening to the Who, for example, and as the Who became harder rock sound, the Beatles responded with Helter Skelter, for example. They were always constantly drawing in all the other influences, even as they were creating. So I think that's a big part of it. I think our modern world is kind of we think of it being defined by this kind of necessity to reinvent yourself as an artist, and to kind of we admire people who shapeshift in that way. And I think they were real. They really set the template for doing that themselves. How does that sound?
Yes, I think there's a point here, but let me also add another point to it, and let's take the Lennon McCartney songwriting team. I think a team like that hasn't come for a long time and wasn't there before them, of course, because others used to write songs for the big stars of the day. Um, each player, each participant, each member of that group contributed something. George Harrison's guitar, Ringo Starr's drumming, which really blended with the song. It was a composite band. Now, if I talk about the lyrics, I don't think I can hum or want to hum a song by, say, The Who, which was a pretty innovative band in its time, or Pink Floyd, which was doing some great albums, concept albums. But they are not 3-minute songs that I would want to um, play at different times of my day or at different moods, while the Beatles are the whole composite thing which give me music for every occasion and in every mood and every flavor and in every kind of with every kind of innovation, technological as well as, I mean, what George Martin did, we could talk about that, but also what they did themselves and created this new sounds all the time. So I think it's the compositeness of the band
I agree.
that really stays with us. And I think there is something to be, there is a payoff in simplicity also, because their songs in the beginning and later too are sometimes simple songs that touch us. Now we take something like Imagine or Let It Be. You're not Imagine, but say Let It Be or uh, something, or Hey Jude. They're simple songs. They're great music happening there, but they are, easy to sing along. So maybe I'm throwing a lot of things together, but I'm just thinking to myself as a fan and as a questioner, could that be one of the reasons?
I think even the songs that you describe as simple, I mean, there's the gift of melody in it, isn't there? I mean,
Yes.
That's why we sing along with them, and that's something that is maybe deceptive. It feels simple, but we immediately find a melody catchy because there's something brilliant in it, and it's not something that can be easily done. I mean, you mentioned the songwriting partnerships and I mean, Lennon and McCartney. I don't think there has been a sort of duo in the pop music era that's been comparable, really, as songwriters. And as you said, they drew on all these different influences, and they themselves early on, they also looked to the sort of generation before of these, like the sort of Motown songwriters or Brill Building songwriters from Tin Pan Alley, and they were looking at these, great composers of 50s pop songs or 40s pop songs and seeing themselves as like that, as being a songwriting partnership. So they drew on all these different influences. They were, they absolutely loved their American rock and roll, black music, Little Richard, and so on. But they're also drawing on, more other types of songwriters and the sort of music hall tradition, for example. You hear that a lot in Paul's songwriting. And so, as you said, there's a song for every mood almost. As a fan, you can find something that fits the mood that you want at the particular time of day. I think if it was easy to kind of bottle what they did and this sort of simple magic, we'd all be doing it, or we'd all be able to. We wouldn't be talking about it 60 years later and still trying to put our finger on what it was. I think that's the beauty of it. Is it's so multifarious and complex.
So Chuck Berry used to complain that they had copied him, and, and that John Lennon copied him, and that John Lennon then had to use 3 of his songs. I think there was a case that was settled out of court. So, but they were very, very clear that they were absorbing influences from Little Richard, from Chuck Berry, from so many others. In fact, as time went on, they picked up hints from Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan complained that all they were doing is picking up ideas that he was putting forward. But they had no hesitation in saying they were absorbing these influences.
Yeah, they were fans as well themselves, weren't they?
Yeah.
They were so excited to meet Little Richard early on, and then were playing his songs. And in that film you briefly mentioned, Beatles '64, which was just released recently, there's a clip of George Harrison playing. They're down in Florida in early 1964, and he's playing an acoustic guitar and he's singing in a Bob Dylan style. And it's so in the moment. We know he became this massive Bob Dylan fan, but he's obviously just been listening to Freewheeling Bob Dylan album and the Talking Blues style. That's all. There's the excitement of the moment for them. That they're fans as well as being these phenomenal musicians themselves, and they can bring it all in.
Interestingly, he did sing a Bob Dylan number, If Not For You, later on for his triple album, and later created this super group with Bob Dylan and others, the Traveling Wilburys.
Yeah.
So they were not sly cheaters.
No, he
were
was
very much open about it.
Yeah,
And picked up these.
I think it would be fair to say that for George, probably his 2 musical heroes were Ravi Shankar, who, as you said, I wrote about, and I think Bob Dylan. I think he was good friends with Dylan, but he was also in awe of him as what he'd done, and as you say, he wore that on his sleeve. They all did. They love to talk about their influences.
So now I'm going to go somewhat deeper into why their music was changing. It's very, 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 for us 60 years later to say, oh, so so what? But at that moment, some of the music that was come out, you can imagine you're 60 years old, you're 16, 18, whatever, and you listen to this song like Nowhere Man or or even Tomorrow Never Knows, and you wonder to yourself what's going on. And so today they're part of the our soundtrack, so it's not that impressive. It doesn't sound that impressive. So I thought after the first 3 or 4 albums, which were full of young love songs, each of their albums after Rubber Soul, which came in 1965, which is just 2 years after their first album.
Mm.
Just 2 years later, just think about it. 2 years later, they say, Please, Please Me. And in Rubber Soul, they have Nowhere Man, Norwegian Wood with its sitar. And most of all, In My Life, which is completely a revolutionary song. The whole melody is completely revolutionary. It's the first time Lennon is writing about his life.
Mm.
It took 2 years. That's quite a development, isn't it? And they had about 4 or 5 albums in between. They were producing albums like anything. I think they produced something like 12 or 13 albums in those 7 or 8 years. And in the American market, they produced something like 17. So
Yeah.
they were prolific. So tell me about what Rubber Soul must have represented at that time.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you picked up on In My Life, because as you say, it's this autobiographical song with written by John Lennon mostly, in which he's reflecting on his childhood, and he's kind of admitting to his own sort of nostalgia for the past, and it's part of this development where he's talking about his frailties more and more. He'd done this already in the song Help, and that I think it's so important that they'd moved on from these initial songs where they were addressing the object of love, love me do, please please me, and then now it's talking about feelings, and maybe this is a response perhaps to listen to Bob Dylan, or just to starting to develop as artists, but the music has that sense of nostalgia and sensitivity that matches the words, and this is the art form is really being taken on to another level now, where the music and the words working together. It's a fantastic song, and there's that lovely middle eight on the piano, which is actually played by George Martin, their producer. So I think these kind of instrumental touches as well that marked them out, where you'd have like a sort of harpsichord style solo there, or you had a string quartet on Yesterday earlier that same year. Things that were new, you just wouldn't expect to find that on a pop song in 1964
Or a
65.
sitar.
Or, as you said, that same album, you've got George's first efforts on sitar on Norwegian Wood. So they were always pushing on in that way. Yeah, I mean, his first efforts were, by his own admission, very, very amateur. This is before he'd even met Ravi Shankar, which didn't happen until the following summer in 1966. But he'd been listening to Ravi Shankar's albums and become fascinated by the sitar. And David Crosby of the Byrds had spoken to him and also encouraged him to listen to Ravi's records. And so George got himself a cheap sitar in London. And when they were just recording this song that John Lennon had written, Norwegian Wood, he just, as they tended to do, was sort of reached for something innovative. And so he brought the sitar into the studio and added a solo on. And again, you've got a completely new sound, which was something we associate with them album by album. They're bringing in all these different sounds, innovation. And yeah. I think you get this progression. I mean, you hear it even more the next album, which is Revolver. You hear the sound moving on even more. It's I think would be one of my top two, maybe, of favorite of their albums, Revolver. There's such wonderful songwriting on it, and the sounds. I mean, the first song, the last song on the album is, as you mentioned, is Tomorrow Never Knows, which is a completely revolutionary soundscape with all these sort of backwards tapes and use of snatches of sitar and tambura, and treating John Lennon's vocal like he's a Tibetan Lama singing from the mountaintop, um, and it was actually the first song they recorded that album. It wasn't like people often think they're just about to do Sergeant Pepper, so it's the sort of stepping stone, but it's the other way around. That was actually the first thing they recorded for that album. Phenomenal.
For Revolver.
The Revolver, yes. So I'm jumping on to the next album.
Yeah, but for Revolver, for me, the song, of course, that's a great song, Tomorrow
Yeah.
Never Knows. And I later found out that the seagull kind of shrieking sounds were Paul, and they had either double looped the tape or
Yes.
put the tape at full speed, but recorded it by half speed or the other way around,
Yeah.
something very technical.
Yeah.
So, but it's just an, it's just a song that even today I wonder how they must have done it. So you
Yeah.
can imagine what it must have been back there in those days, 66,
It's
65.
interesting because, as you said, they were using tape loops on that song. So little short spools of physical tape, which they, just glue the end onto it and then run it through the head of a tape player. And there may be sort of 5-second samples. And you get this sort of seagull-like sound. Or one of them is a backwards bit of sitar playing. And they're all mixed live in the studio. I mean, this is the really cutting edge of the time. They were actually copying what some of the sort of electronic composers were doing at that time. People like Stockhausen, and I mean, they were drawing on these influences to bring it into pop music. And now you could do that on your computer in a matter of seconds. You could do a little loop and play it. But back then it was cutting edge, and it required like this sort of wonderful analog technology to sort of run through a tape loop through a machine while they were live mixing. And it's amazing to think that's how they did that stuff. But I think maybe you're almost, because you're at the limits of the technology, it makes you very, very creative. You have to think about, how can we do this in a new way? What can we do that nobody's done before, given the limits of technology? And still working on, I think, probably 4-track recording at that time on Revolver. So these are technical limits that they, at that time, you were asking about Rubber Soul, Revolver. They were starting to use the studio as an instrument in itself. Yeah, they were spending more time in the studio. They were, first album they recorded in one day. They just went in and recorded all the songs that they wanted to put on it, and they did a long 12-hour session or something and recorded it. And by now, though, they're spending days on each track increasingly, and then that with Sergeant Pepper in '67, released in '67, that becomes much more time spent in the studio.
I think they'd given up live touring, live performances.
Yes, in 1966, they by that time all the kind of hoopla around the tours was just becoming unbearable, and they were getting death threats, and it was just ceasing to be fun. So after their their last American tour in August 1966, they just decided it wasn't no point going on the road anymore, and what they'd rather do was immerse themselves in the studio and start expanding their lives more, getting a bit more control over their own lives in a way. So it's and then as I said, they were able to explore the studio and what could be done there, and that was all new.
And they had a sound engineer like Jeff Emmerich, who was ready to do their bidding.
Yes, I think that they had in retrospect, it feels like they had a bit of a knack of collecting them around them, a few really key individuals who brought the best out of them. Jeff Emmerich, you mentioned, the engineer, I think was 19 when they did Revolver.
That's
he
right.
was working at Abbey Road Studios in London, where they recorded almost everything that they did. And Jeff Emmerich was working under their wonderful producer, George Martin, who, was this different kind of personality from them, but really complemented them so well and just brought the best out of them in a fantastic way. So I think they had this knack of collecting people, compared to a kind of modern day pop star band or whatever, which often have big entourages. They had this kind of small collection of really key people. Brian Epstein, their manager, of course, who just they seem to have the knack of picking the right people.
So before we leave Revolver behind us, I mean, I'm not going album by album, but before we leave Revolver behind us, I must mention an extremely unusual song like Eleanor Rigby, which had only orchestration and none of that. The band didn't play. There was no drums. There was no guitar. It's just Paul McCartney and an orchestra. And I think that too must have been quite significant at that time. Apart from the fact that it's extremely well written song, it's an extremely well written song, and so each album had at least 3 or 4, 5 classics, present day classics and future classics, and classics that have remained with us. I'm sure Eleanor Rigby still has a lot of downloads.
It's a timeless song, isn't it?
It's absolutely timeless. It's about loneliness. It's about so many things, and it's written in a very, very simple way. I use the word simple in its most eclectic sense without making it sound simplistic. But yes, those songs, that song, and it loops so well as a story.
And it's stripped down. I think that's probably what you mean by the simplicity, that there's just his voice and then the strings. It's a string octet, actually.
Yes.
It's just 8 musicians, string musicians. And
I stand corrected. I thought it was a full orchestra.
No, it's that simple. It's that stripped down. It's and they were influenced by it was George Martin who arranged it. Paul wrote it and asked George Martin to arrange the strings, because Paul didn't write music scores, and they were influenced by Bernard Herrmann, who was the film composer who'd worked a lot with Hitchcock, and he'd done the famous film score for The Birds. And particularly Psycho is actually what I should really mention, because it's got those harsh string sounds in it, and quite sort of angular, not this sort of lush string sound that we might have expected. And that's what they did on Eleanor Rigby, and it just works so well. Although it's using a string octet, eight string players, which almost sounds quite conservative, it's done in a very innovative way, and for a pop song, it just works so well.
So now, before I move on to other questions, one last song in one last album, and that is, though of course I'm tempted to talk about Abbey Road, and that might require a show of its own, but Sgt. Pepper, Lonely Hearts Club Band, A Day in the Life. Now, what can you tell us about that song in terms of its technical, the work that's gone into it, and the writing?
So interestingly, it's made up of separate songs. One originally written by John Lennon and one by Paul McCartney, and which are spliced together. So the joins between the songs are also really interesting, because they use this time they do use a full orchestra to have these incredible crescendos. I mean, it's just gone to a completely different level of production and arrangement and composition from those early simple songs. This is really feeling. I think it felt revolutionary at the time, this approach. And the very close of the song, the orchestra builds up to this enormous crescendo, with all the instruments are basically being told to, and the orchestra were told to play up to the very highest note they could play on their instrument, and you get this sort of crashing, dissonant chord at the end. I mean, it's just like music from another world, really. And yet within that, you've got these beautiful melodies. You've got, I read the news today, oh boy, opening. I mean, it's such everything is in there. There's sort of tenderness right through to this cataclysm or whatever it is at the end.
And it still sounds revolutionary.
I think so. Yes. I mean, people have done things like that, but it's captured something. Really, really, it did so.
Now, there were other bands at that time, like, as I mentioned, the Rolling Stones, who were their exact contemporaries, and bands that came later, a little later, Pink Floyd, The Who, Led Zeppelin, and so many others. Rolling Stones are still rolling. They keep performing.
Yeah.
Mick Jagger looks younger every day and still prances around the stage. Keith, what can one say about Keith Richards? He's going to be around forever.
Yeah.
And they're a pretty good band on stage. It's not that they sound doddering. Their songs are popular. And yet, and they have said, and their fans keep saying that look at the Rolling Stones, they've been performing live for the last so many years, 60 years almost. And yet, that eternal debate, Beatles or Rolling Stones, is there a debate really?
I was always, I mean, I love the Stones, but I was always much more of a Beatles fan from my childhood. So to me, no, there's no debate. But of course, there are people who, there are plenty of people who prefer the Stones. I think was one thing that's interesting that maybe you're touching on here is that is the sort of afterlife of the Beatles after they broke up in 1970, and bands like the Stones kept going on, and Led Zeppelin became enormous, and Pink Floyd sold, I don't know, 50 million copies of Dark Side of the Moon. I suppose it was not inevitable that the Beatles would remain as popular as they have done down the decades. And I think that's quite interesting to think about, because you and I have lived through that phase. I mean, to me, it always seemed that they were there up at the pinnacle. I was actually born in 1970, which is the year they split up. So my formative years, I mean, I liked a lot of the sort of 1980s pop music that I grew up with, but I've always had the Beatles there. They were somehow the first band I discovered as a boy, and they were always the kind of pinnacle. And they've always kept coming back into my life very happily. But usually what happens with a lot of artists is they sort of gradually fade, don't they, in popularity over the years and the decades, and maybe there's a bit of a revival. But why did the Beatles remain so, why have they remained at this level? I think one of the things is that they themselves, and their own company, which is Apple Corps, have done a really good job of keeping them in the limelight. This started, I mean, in particular, I think of the anthology projects in the 1990s. I mean, full disclosure, I worked on the book. I was one of the editors who worked on that book. But they also put out this hugely successful TV series, which was like reviewing all their history, first-person interviews with the three of them who are still alive, and then old footage of John, who had sadly been murdered by that point. And then also they put out albums of rarities at the time, and it really sort of put rocket boosters under their reputation. And they really, they suddenly were selling huge amounts of albums again. They put out this album called the Beatles One album.
Yes,
I think it's the year 2000, and it was a very clever idea, actually, of Neil Aspinall, who was the head of Apple at the time, which was just to put all the number one records, all the number one singles they'd had on one album. They'd had sort of greatest hits collection before, what they call the blue and the red albums, which are completely phenomenal. But the idea just to have a single album, CD as it then was, of all their number one hits, and it sold, I think it was their biggest selling album ever or something. So this is very clever kind of curating of their history, and that's gone on. We talk about these films that have been made, like Peter Jackson's wonderful Get Back series and Beatles 64, and the kind of repackaging of albums. I think they've been, really astute in the way they've done it, and they've kept the music in the limelight and kept it relevant, and always kind of protected the quality of it. Didn't want to just license it all out to everyone to do whatever they wanted to do and make a bit of extra money. It was always like about protecting the quality.
On the other hand, I may argue that if the Stones were producing new albums every other year or whatever, and were touring, and were in the public face, why would the Beatles and so many new bands had come, so many new artists had come, so many musical styles had come? There is no reason why those albums would have succeeded unless there was something at the core of it.
Yeah, it's not just down to marketing. No, I mean, I think, as I think I said at the beginning, that the core of it is this fabulous music, which we could talk about all day. But I think it has been astute what they've done in terms of keeping it relevant, putting out new offerings. You referred to the Grammy they've just won, which is pretty amazing for a band that hasn't, formally been in existence for whatever it is, 55 years. But they released this song Now and Then, which is what you're referring to.
Yes.
Which actually was not recorded in the 60s. That's the one. It's just about the only thing they did that wasn't recorded in the 60s, because it was a John Lennon recording, solo recording from the 70s, to which they added extra tracks. First of all, in 1994, I think it is, when George added his piece, and then was finished off a couple of years or so ago by Paul and Ringo, and they were able to use this fantastic AI technology that Peter Jackson had developed in order to separate out the John Lennon voice. And I mean, it's magic. It's, how they've done that. And there you've got, the last new Beatles song. There won't be another, as they say. But it, what an incredible, clever thing to do to keep us all wanting to hear the Beatles again.
Tricky question. Tricky because people have been trying to, find the answer to this one. Why did they break up? Was it John and Yoko's presence? Was it creative differences? Was it George getting very, very restless and wanted to pursue a solo career? And so did the others wanted to pursue their solo careers. What was that one reason why they split?
Well, yeah, I don't really want to disappoint you here, but I'm not sure there is one reason. I think if there's one reason, it's just that they were growing apart, as people do as they get a bit older, and they didn't want to spend all their lives in each other's pockets. And the tensions had started up over whether it's personal relationships or money or this and that. And I think they just grown apart by that point. I mean, all those things applied. George in particular felt like he was happy to move on, and it was John who really announced it to the other members of the band in September 1969 that he was going to leave, and he was going to, that was it. They'd just done Abbey Road. But I don't know that there's any one particular reason. I wouldn't blame Yoko Ono at all, really, on this. It's just that they all grew apart. I think one thing that was really fascinating about the Peter Jackson Get Back series was to see John and Paul in particular working together in the studio. I mean, all of them, you get a sense of how they operated as a team. But there's this sort of myth that had built up that by the time that was recorded in January 1969, those sessions, that John and Paul were kind of really at daggers at each other, and they'd really fallen out permanently, and there was all this tension between them, and that the sessions were terribly miserable, and it's a kind of revelation to watch that series because it's all filmed, fly on the wall, multi-camera film job, very innovative for its time. And you see so often that Paul and John are still riffing off each other, constantly inspiring each other, telling jokes, writing songs in front of us. And it was really a revelation. In fact, it was a revelation even to Paul McCartney himself, who admitted that he had kind of accepted the kind of popular myth that he and John had fallen out by that time. And he said it was really, it surprised him to watch that footage and to remember now, actually, no, we were still getting on pretty well. And, there was this still fantastic partnership between them. So they were still able to make this amazing music in 1969, and it just drifted apart. They were still, I think, it's like being in a sort of very intense relationship almost, that they it just became too intense, over too many outside pressures on them, that they just needed a bit of a break from each other, and unfortunately for us, the break became permanent.
And you must have seen the video of them playing on the rooftop.
Yeah,
and they were pretty much operating as a unit.
Phenomenal band, weren't they? I mean, that's
and that was their last hurrah.
Their last live show, yeah. They recorded Abbey Road after that. Later that year, they continued on in the studio, but they didn't play another concert. But yeah, what a band! What a live band they were. I mean,
what a great band! Yeah,
phenomenal.
And to see them live. So to round up, Abbey Road, their last great album. I won't talk about Let It Be and what it became, but Abbey Road, some great stuff, ending with The End.
Yeah.
So quite the finale send off by the Beatles to their fans.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a huge fan of that. There's what was the second side of the vinyl album. There's this big long medley of songs, which you'll know very well, Sidharth. It's almost uncanny how good that is. If this is your last album, that's how you're going to go out, and then your very final song is called The End.
Yes,
phenomenal.
So that was the great way to end their career. And in fact, there's always speculation, and I'm going to bring up this question and perhaps give up one possible reply, is that what if they had continued? And I think if they didn't, it doesn't matter, because I think they gave us some great music.
Yeah. I mean, they were often asked in later years to reform, and then I think it was all something that they could never really agree on, and it just all seemed too big.
Yeah,
freighted with too much baggage, maybe. But they worked, individually. They worked with each other on projects.
Yeah,
and the big one being the Anthology, when they eventually, in the 90s, the three surviving members got back together in the studio. But by that time, John wasn't around. So who knows? Yeah, I mean, I think at the time they split up, of course, they didn't know it was going to be permanent. They just wasn't impossible that a couple of years later they could have got back together and reformed, as so many bands do.
So like the Eagles, yes, they keep saying no, and then hell freezes over, and they go around the world. But again, we are no closer to answering that $64 million question. Why do they endure? And I think they endure because they are great.
Yeah, it's the simple, not very helpful answer, but yes, we even in their time in the 60s, there was a famous review when I think it was the White Album came out, where somebody compared them to Schubert. And I think we have to think of them in those terms as being, really not just a phenomenon of the 1960s, but of the 20th century, or, they're this marker in musical history.
So, last provocative question. provocative because I think it's provocative, but you may not find it so.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
How many of the current superstars will be around 60 years from today? Their music.
Oh, I don't know. I don't think I'm really qualified to judge that. Because you get older, you start to realize how out of touch you get with musical trends. I'm sure some of them will. I'm sure it may not be the ones we expect, perhaps even, the artists, if you go back to that era, the 60s or the 70s, there are artists who were relatively small at the time who have somehow had wonderful afterlives. I went to a great concert last summer at the BBC Proms in London, of which was orchestral arrangements of the music of Nick Drake. I don't know. Do you know Nick Drake? Sidharth? So
No.
he was a sort of, at the time, quite a minor folk singer, folkish, mainly singer-songwriter with his guitar, and he's gained this big reputation to the point where, long after he died very young, sadly. But at the time he made those albums, he didn't have very much impact, and nobody would have thought we'd be playing it 50 years later. So sometimes you get these surprises, that people gain, in the afterlife, they gain their reputation.
I mean, no doubt there are music groups which were not that big at the time, or a bit niche, and then suddenly have become cult bands like the Velvet Underground,
Yeah.
Which is a good band.
Yeah.
But
Fantastic.
Nothing on this scale. And I think the 60s were something quite unique as a period too. So many of those bands will continue, I think.
Yeah.
I think Pink Floyd ain't going nowhere. They are really good. And so also the others I mentioned. Led Zeppelin keeps picking up new listeners all the time. So I think, but the Beatles are the Beatles.
Yeah. So we've had a long chat about them, and we've concluded that the Beatles are the Beatles.
Yes, that's my conclusion. You may want to give something else. Thank you.
But I'm with you on that.
Yeah,
I agree.
Thank you, Oliver. Once again, chatting with you. I hope you'll write another book on them. I mean, I'm amazed at how many books and movies keep coming out. And we'll be back. That was Oliver Craske talking
Thanks.
about a subject we both were very, very interested in and got involved in. Why do the Beatles endure? And we'll be back once again next week with another guest. Till then, from me, Sidharth Bhatia, and the rest of the Wire Talks team, goodbye.